Okay. Welcome to Bite-Sized PD at Acadience U. I am Laura Tuesday Heathfield in the Instructional Supports Department, and I am joined today with the fabulous Sally Ann Weekly, also from the Instructional Supports Department. And today we are going to present on Acadience Math and Pathways of Progress. And just an advanced warning, we are recording this session. And Sally Ann will verify that we are recording because I can't see that we are.
We are recording, yes.
Excellent. Okay. So if you don't want to be seen, keep your camera off, and that'll be fine. So I'm just going to quickly review our professional development norms. They are be committed, be responsible, be respectful, and be safe. And you can see there are specific things that you can focus on for today. Also, professional development norms related to video conferencing. Be sure to mute your microphone and turn off your camera if you're not comfortable being video recorded, or blur your background if you want. If you have a question or comment while we're presenting, please just type it in the chat and we will do our best to answer all the questions. A reminder that we are following the CSD MTSS framework. And Acadience Math fits nicely into this framework, as does Pathways of Support to monitor student growth. Our learning intention is today we are learning about Acadience Math and the resources available so that you will be able to support your students with math interventions using Acadience data. And the success criteria, you will know you are successful when you have enough knowledge to provide your students with data-driven math instruction and interventions. So we're going to go through a 8-step process of using Acadience math data. And the first one is obviously doing a benchmark assessment. We do benchmark assessments at the beginning of the year, the middle of the year, and the end of year, in case you're not familiar with those BOY, MOY, EOY abbreviations. I'm going to briefly review what benchmarking means. So benchmark goals are the level of skill that we want students to be at in order to predict that they're going to achieve the next benchmark goal or math outcome. And the cut points that we have for our risk categories of at-risk or well below, at-risk or well below, indicate the level of skill below which students are unlikely to achieve the subsequent math goals without additional supports. So the benchmark assessments help us identify which students might be at risk for not meeting the next benchmark goal. And an example of that is a third grade student should reach a math composite score of 100 by the end of the year to be on track for fourth grade math. And benchmark goals are the same for all students in a grade, regardless of where they start at the beginning of the year. But they are not equivalent to proficiency on standards. They're simply predicting the next benchmark goal. There are 4 different benchmark levels in Acadience Math, the same as Acadience Reading. Above benchmark, the odds are generally 90 to 99% that the student will meet the next benchmark. At benchmark, the odds are 70 to 85%. Below benchmark, it's kind of a 50-50 shot that they will meet the next benchmark. And if a student is in that well below benchmark, the odds are pretty low, 10 to 20% that they'll reach that later benchmark without additional supports. And what we've found is that that above benchmark is more predictive of proficiency at the end of the year than the at benchmark. So you really want to get your students to be performing in that above benchmark range, if at all possible. So the math composite is made up of the various math measures that are administered at each grade level and each time of year, and they do vary. So you really can't compare a composite score from one test time to another test time because sometimes they're weighted differently at different points in time and different grade levels. But we do need the composite score to be able to calculate a pathway, and a pathway helps us determine whether a student is making typical or typical progress or above typical or below typical progress, either from beginning of year to middle of year or beginning of year to end of year. So after we do our benchmark assessments, we ideally want to establish an individual pathway or goal for each student, which is why the pathways is built into Acadience Math. And the purpose of pathways is to give us a way to compare students by, first of all, setting a goal that's not only meaningful, but ambitious enough so that the student will make good progress and attainable. We don't want it to be so far out of reach that they can't meet that goal and get frustrated. And it also helps us evaluate student progress. So if we have a goal and the student we're tracking their progress toward that goal and it looks like they're not going to meet that goal, we need to do something different in order to ensure that that student will meet that goal. So these pathways of progress are designed to be used in addition to, but not in place of the benchmark goals. So each student still has a benchmark goal, but then they also have this pathway goal. And the pathway goal is more akin to a rate of improvement than a specific goal. And like I mentioned before, it kind of tells us the rate of progress, whether it's typical or above or below typical. There are 5 levels of pathways of progress, same as there are for Acadience reading. And you can see them there, 1 through 5, and they equate to typical, above typical, well above typical, and below typical, and well below typical. Generally, we want students to be making at least typical progress, and ideally students who are behind benchmark goals, we want them to be making above or well above typical progress. So these next couple of slides kind of explain pathways of progress in a visual way so that you can better understand. So essentially, the pathways allow us to make growth comparisons with students that start at the same place. So the beginning of year composite score. In this example, Janie has a composite score of 90. Alyssa has a composite score of 130. They're never compared with each other. Janie at 90 is only compared with other students who scored a 90 at the beginning of the year. And same for Alyssa. She would only be compared with other students that scored a composite of 130 at the beginning of the year, so that they're equated at the start, and it's similar to student growth percentiles. So then the pathway that we target is defined by the distribution of scores at the end of the year. So although Janie scored 90 and other students scored 90, their score at the end of the year might vary considerably. And so how those pathways were developed is they looked at the range of scores that students at the same starting point could possibly achieve at the end of the year. And then they divided these end of year scores into quintiles, which are 20% gaps between them, which equate then to those 5 pathways that we talked about previously. So it's essentially a mathematical formula that we can predict then all students that start at the same starting point, what kind of level of progress they'll need to make to essentially achieve that end of year goal. And when we're setting those goals for each student, I mentioned before that they need to be ambitious. In other words, they should be able to challenge the student to make above or well above typical growth, particularly if they're behind. But it shouldn't be so high that it's unrealistic. So it needs to be attainable. And also it needs to be meaningful in that the change should result in better student outcomes for the student and increase the likelihood they're going to be successful. So we have to keep those 3 things in mind when we're establishing a goal. So those goals are designed to increase the odds of that student achieving important outcomes. And as the box in the red font says, that typical, below typical, and well below typical progress are not ambitious for any student who is likely to need support. So we typically don't choose a pathway that's typical, below typical, or well below typical. Above typical progress is generally both attainable and ambitious for students who are likely to need support. However, that well above typical for students who are needing support, it might be attainable or might not be. And so that's kind of where the judgment comes in when you're establishing a goal for a particular student. As teachers, you know your students pretty well, and the score on Acadience Math, the composite score, is only one indicator, and you may have other information about that particular student that helps you decide whether above typical or well above typical progress would be achievable for that student. So then step 3, we want to use a way to kind of group our students that are struggling in terms of how we might provide some additional supports. And the first step in that is to use the initial grouping suggestions that are built into the Acadience platform. So this is a screenshot of the acadiancelearning.net platform. You would essentially click on class and student reports and then initial grouping suggestions. And what that will give you, based on whether you look at beginning of year or middle of year, is a grouping of your students into 4 different categories. One is, group 1 is typically the ones that need core support but don't need additional supports to likely make the next benchmark goal. And then the other 3 categories, in this particular example, I believe it's a 3rd grade example. Group 2 are students that need additional supports in computation, and that, in concepts and application. Group 3, students that need additional support in computation. And then group 4 are students that might need additional support in both computation and concepts and applications. So it groups the students for you into these 4 initial categories, which may be helpful to start thinking about instructional strategies. The issue in math skills is skills build on each other, so they're different than how we group students for reading instruction, because even if a student may need additional support in, say, computation, I might have 8 students listed there, but they all might need different skills within computation. Some may need subtraction without borrowing, and some may need addition skills. So we have to look more specifically at what skills they may be needing additional support for. That's where we can use our data dashboard to identify which skills individual students miss. So once you have your students identified that need additional support in one of those areas or both areas, we can use data dashboard, specifically the Acadience Math by Skill module. So you can pull up your students there on your left, and then each of the skills that were assessed in the Acadience Math benchmark are listed there, and they obviously tie then to our Utah standards. So I can look in that first column and identify easily by just the green, yellow, and red which students are doing okay with that skill and which students might need additional support. And you'll see in each of those columns, when you go into dashboard, there's a little tiny up and down arrow next to each column, and you can actually sort either ascending or descending to get a better idea of which students might need additional support for a specific skill. We also have to keep in mind in math, even if we have, so in this particular example, the 4th column, the first 4 students all have 0%. It may be that that skill hasn't been taught yet. And so we have to think about what time of year that we're assessing in to determine whether that's a targeted skill for instruction or whether that's coming later in the curriculum map. Another way to group students is to take that data from data dashboard and put it into an Excel spreadsheet and look at the different skills across the top columns and do some sorting and determine which students might need additional support. We've linked those spreadsheets for you if you'd like to use them. Your instructional coaches also have access to those spreadsheets and could help you do that if you wanted to do a little more fine-tuned sorting with them. The next step is to determine some further delineation of which students need additional supports. And I believe, Sally Ann, you're going to jump in here.
Yep, I will jump in.
Okay.
So if you look at the data, once you've got the data found, you can do this on the dashboard or you could do it on the spreadsheet that you create yourself. You need to decide, is this a skill? First of all, like Laura mentioned, is a skill we haven't taught yet, so that'll come later. But if it's a skill I've taught, I look, and if you see the red column here, this column of adding two-digit numbers, every single student in my class needs support with that. So this is a skill. Adding two digits with renaming is something I will do whole class, versus the next slide that has we have some students who've already mastered this. So I don't need to reteach my whole class this subtraction with one or two digit without renaming. I just need to pull this group of students back, work with them. If my list is longer than I want to be, this might be two different groups during skill-based time that I can work with rather than a whole class. So you need to figure out the three things. Is it a whole class intervention? Is it a skill done during a skill-based time, or is it something I haven't taught? So keep those things in mind as you look at your Acadience data. We've also created, because every problem is connected to a skill and standard, our math team here in Acadience in the instructional supports department created documents to help support you. So each document, this is for specifically benchmark 2 we've just taken. It shows the problem, what skill is being assessed, and then what standard it's linked to. And so you will find those linked with the link there, and we have them for all grade levels. We've completed all of the computation when the state also provided some documents to support with the grades 1, 2, and 3, since they're part of the new state SB 150. We need to make sure we're making progress specifically in those grades. So the resources will be linked in the CSD Acadience math resources right there on the right. So the next thing we need to do, once we know what students have deficits in, then we need to intervene using targeted resources, not just be willy-nilly, but actually be supportive in targeted resources. And one great thing we do have is Envision has a lot of great resources we can use to do intervention. Specifically, every single lesson within the Envision program has an intervention activity. The good thing about this is they make it concrete. So this one specifically, you'll use place value blocks, and they're taught differently than they were taught during the whole group instruction. So there's probably a reason they didn't get the first time, so you wouldn't want to just reteach in the same manner, but you would use the intervention activity right in the lesson to support you in moving forward with that skill or standard. Another great piece that we have in Envision is the Math Diagnostic and Intervention System. I have there on the left, you can find it digitally, or on the right, you see the black and red boxes. And you can use these for whether you're looking for skills or standards. So remember the Math Diagnostics and Intervention System that's found both in your digital pieces as well as your print pieces. And on the next slide, you notice that you can parse it out by skills. So every booklet, this was booklet C specifically, you notice the skills are listed. This is the K3 book, I believe. Yes, K3. So we have the skills. So if I had subtraction 100 chart was an issue, I can go to lesson 5-1 or 5-6 and use the intervention lesson we just talked about right in the instructional materials to support that. We also can use the MDIS materials. So on the next slide, you see the correlation to the standards. So if 3 MBT1 was a standard that my students would need to support in, then I would I could go to my 8-5 lesson in Envision, or I can use my intervention kit. So I would pull booklet A and do lesson 45 with them to help support that standard. If you notice, MBT2 has quite a few more lessons. So it looks like a lot of topic 8 and topic 9 had study of NBT3 and BT2. So I could use the intervention lessons found there, or I can go into my black box, open B41. There's a lesson on it, C25, C26. So there are supports both in your teacher edition as well as in the intervention lesson of the MDIS kit that will support you in helping students master the standards and skills. So next, after we've taught, we need to make sure we're monitoring the skills progress using assessments. And there are multiple ways we can do this. In the early grades, it's actually the early numeracy probes right in Acadience they're good to use because I can give a probe, 1 minute probe. And the best thing about that is I can enter in my Acadience platform. So if you notice here, the key indicators, this came from some supports we got from the state. So in kindergarten, at the beginning of the year, you would be progress monitoring on BQD and NNF. So beginning quantity discrimination, next number fluency. Middle of the year, you'd move to number identification, stick with next number fluency, and then so on. First grade, we would start with the advanced quantity discrimination and NNF and get those solid before we move to computation. And then if you are in the second through fifth grade, you would have to decide whether you start computation and which skills. The great thing about the early numeracy is you can enter your progress monitor scores right in the AcadienceLearning.net platform, so it can monitor the progress for you, which is a bit of we're still working on that with the 2.5. So early numeracy, you give the actual Acadience probe, enter it in the progress monitoring in Acadience Learning, and then you have a good record of how the progress is going with the instruction. So that's great for the early numeracy. We need to still problem solve. We're working our team to figure out computation and concepts and applications. Since teachers haven't been correcting the assessments, it's hard to give them and know how to correct them and then put them in the Acadience platform. So we are working on that as far as Acadience goes, but we do have some good ideas for what you can do now until we get all that, or in addition to the Acadience. You could do, let's say a student was working on that subtraction of a 1-digit number. You can go in and create quick checks and just pull up the standards that have to do with that skill you're working on and use that for your progress monitor. You could also do a team creative assessment, created assessment that if this is obviously 2-digit subtraction with regrouping. So I can give them quick assessments. I may have to have a tracking sheet I could create on my computer or just a paper pencil and watch the progress. Because if the student's making the progress, that's what would be expected. As soon as they reach mastery, move on to the next skill. So if they're not, we need to know that so we don't just keep doing the same thing and not make any progress. So remember, you need to keep tracking sheets for individual students so you know if the instruction you're giving is working, and regularly track that progress on the targeted computation or application skills. So instruct, assess, and make sure it's working. If not, we need to adjust the instruction to make sure we can get the progress we would like. And finally, we need to adjust instruction, grouping it as the progress monitoring data indicates, which I just said. So let's look at a few ideas there. This is a progress monitoring report in computation, just one example. So if you've set a goal or you've set a pathway for your students, this student, if we look at, by the end of the year, if we keep this up, he could make the progress where he's at least out of the woods, not out of the woods, at least he's up in the area of well below. So he's making progress. Should we adjust instruction? We might need to, because it looks like we've gone 2 months and only gained 7 problems. So make sure you not only progress monitor, but look at the data and make some new decisions on your instruction. And then if you have questions about progress monitoring, what's best practice, if you go into your CSDA curriculum instructional guides, you will find a page on progress monitoring to help support you. Thank you for attending our bite-sized PD. We appreciate you being here and listening. Please remember, you may always call Laura, myself, or anyone in Instructional Sports Department for more support, and we look forward to continuing our math instruction. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.